The night my father called my promotion pathetic, there were 37 people in that dining room. 37 people who watched him pick up his wine glass, look me dead in the eyes, and say those words like they were the most natural thing in the world. 37 people who laughed, and not one of them, not a single one, knew that 2 federal agents were already parked outside our house. Not one of them knew that by morning, everything my father had spent 30 years building would begin to collapse. And me, the daughter he had dismissed every single day of her life, I was the reason they were there. My name is Mara Calloway, and this is the story of how the quietest person in every room turned out to be the most dangerous one my father ever underestimated. I want you to stay with me through this entire story, because what happened over the next 72 hours after that dinner changed everything, for my family, for the federal case that had been building for 2 years, and for me personally in ways I still feel every single morning when I wake up. This is not a short story. This is not a simple story, but I promise you, every single minute of it is worth it. Before I tell you about that dinner, I need to take you back, because you cannot understand what happened that night without understanding what came before it. You cannot understand why those words, "Your promotion is pathetic," hit me the way they did unless you understand what it took to earn that promotion in the first place. I grew up in Clarksville, Tennessee, which sits right outside Fort Campbell. If you know anything about military towns, you know they have their own rhythm, their own rules, their own unspoken codes. My father, Colonel Gerald Calloway, retired, had lived by those codes his entire career. He was respected, he was decorated, he had served 26 years and come home with his chest full of medals and his ego even fuller. Our house was the kind of house where his portrait hung in the hallway, where his service ribbons were framed under glass, where every conversation eventually circled back to what he had done, where he had served, who he had known. I was the second of 3 children. My older brother, Daniel, was everything my father wanted in a son. He was loud and confident and quick with a joke, and he had my father's same square jaw and his same way of commanding a room just by walking into it. My younger sister, Lydia, was soft and pretty and had learned early that the fastest way to get what she wanted from our father was to smile at him a certain way and tell him he was right about everything. And then there was me, Mara, the quiet one, the one who read too much and talked too little, the one my father used to look at across the dinner table with this expression I can only describe as mild disappointment, like he wasn't sure exactly how I had ended up in his family. I joined the Army at 22, right out of college. I had studied criminal justice and international law, and when I went through the officer candidate school, I finished in the top 3% of my class. I did not tell my father this. By that point, I had learned that sharing my achievements with him only gave him something to measure and find lacking. He had made general's aide by the time he was 28. He had commanded a battalion by 35. Whatever I did would be, in his eyes, a slightly dimmer version of what he had already done. So I stopped trying to make him see me. I just did the work. And the work, it turned out, was something I was extraordinarily good at. If you're enjoying this story and you want to hear more stories like this, stories about women who refused to stay small, who found their strength in the quietest, most unexpected ways, please take a second right now and subscribe to The Quiet Colonel. Hit that bell so you never miss a story. It means more than you know, and it costs you nothing but a second of your time. Now let me get back to Mara, because what comes next is where this story really begins. I was assigned to the Judge Advocate General's Corps, the JAG Corps, which is the legal branch of the military. I know what some people think when they hear that. They think of desk work and courtrooms and paperwork. And yes, there is paperwork. There is a great deal of paperwork. But there is also this. The JAG Corps investigates military fraud, procurement fraud, contracting fraud, the kind of crimes that bleed defense budgets and line the pockets of people who know how to work a system. The kind of crimes that are incredibly difficult to prove because the people committing them are usually very smart, very connected, and very good at covering their tracks. I had been working a particular investigation for 22 months when my father called my promotion pathetic. I cannot tell you the name of the case. Even now, even after everything became public, there are aspects of it that remain sealed. What I can tell you is the scope of it. What I can tell you is that it involved defense contractors, falsified invoices, and a network of shell companies that had funneled approximately $47 million out of military procurement budgets over a period of 8 years. What I can tell you is that when I first inherited the case from a senior colleague who retired, it looked like a dead end. The paper trail seemed to stop at a wall of LLCs with no clear ownership. Most people who looked at it told me to close it out and move on. I did not close it out. I worked that case the way I do everything, quietly, methodically, without announcing what I was doing or asking anyone to notice. I worked it on weekends. I worked it on holidays. I built a map of those shell companies that eventually filled an entire wall of my office, and I traced every single connection until the wall of LLCs started to look less like a dead end and more like a deliberately constructed maze. And mazes, if you follow them long enough, always have an exit. By the time I was promoted to lieutenant colonel, which is what my father called pathetic, I had already handed my preliminary findings to 2 federal agencies. I had already given 3 depositions. The case had already moved from my desk to a joint task force that included the FBI, the Defense Criminal Investigative Service, and the Department of Justice. I knew, sitting at that dinner table that night, exactly what was parked outside our house and exactly why they were there. My father did not know any of this, which is exactly why he felt comfortable saying what he said. The dinner was for Lydia. She was getting married in the spring, and her fiancé's family had flown in from Atlanta, and my mother had spent 2 days cooking and setting the table with the good china and arranging flowers in crystal vases that only came out for special occasions. It was a beautiful table. It was a lovely evening, right up until the moment it wasn't. We were somewhere between the main course and dessert when my father decided to make a toast. That was always his move at family gatherings. The toast that was really a speech, the speech that was really about him. He stood up with his wine glass and he started talking about Lydia and how proud he was. And that was all fine. That was all expected. But then he pivoted. He always pivoted. He started talking about family and legacy and what it meant to serve with distinction. And I watched his eyes move around the table and land on me, and I felt it before he even said it. That particular quality of attention he had always given me, that assessing, slightly cold attention, like I was a problem he had never quite solved. He said that some people understood what it meant to truly serve. He said that some people had the fire in them, the real fire, the kind that built careers and commanded respect. And then he raised his glass toward me, with this smile that looked generous to everyone else in the room, and he said, "And then some of us get promoted because we filled out the right forms at the right time. Congratulations on your promotion, Mara, even if it is a little pathetic." The table laughed, some of them nervously, some of them genuinely. Lydia looked down at her plate. My mother's smile went very still. Daniel actually clinked his glass against my father's like it was a joke they were sharing. I did not say anything. I picked up my water glass and I took a slow sip, and I set it back down. And I looked at my father and I smiled. Not the smile he expected, not embarrassed or hurt or trying to laugh it off. Just a smile, quiet and even and completely unreadable. He didn't know what to do with that smile. I could see it. He had expected me to flush or deflect or make a self-deprecating comment that would let everyone move on. My stillness bothered him in a way he couldn't name. "Nothing to say?" he asked. "Not tonight," I said. And that was the last real conversation we had before everything changed. The federal agents came to the door at 7:45 the next morning. I know the exact time because I was already awake, already dressed, already on my second cup of coffee. I had known they were coming, not that day specifically, but soon. The case had reached the point where the next step was unavoidable, and that next step involved my father's oldest and closest friend, a man named Warren Briggs, who had retired from the Army as a brigadier general and gone immediately into defense contracting, which is an extremely common and frequently legal career path. Warren Briggs's contracting work, however, was not legal. Warren Briggs was one of the architects of the fraud I had spent 22 months unraveling, and Warren Briggs had been my father's best friend for 31 years. I want to pause here for a moment and tell you something important. I did not know this when I started the case. I want to be absolutely clear about that. When I first began working those files, I did not know that the name buried 6 layers deep in those shell companies would eventually connect to someone I had known my entire life. The investigation led where it led. I followed the evidence. That is the only way I know how to work. But by the time I was sitting at that dinner table, listening to my father call my promotion pathetic, I had known for 4 months that Warren Briggs was going to be arrested, and I had known for 2 months that my father's name had appeared in documents related to the investigation, not as a suspect, not at that point, but as a person of interest, someone who might have had knowledge, someone the agents would want to talk to. I had not told my father any of this. You might ask whether I should have. You might think a daughter owed her father a warning. But here is what I will tell you. My father had spent my entire life telling me in ways large and small that my judgment could not be trusted. He had spent my entire life making me feel like the least significant person in any room I entered. He had said those words the night before, pathetic, in front of Lydia's future in-laws, in front of people I had never met, with a smile on his face and wine in his hand. And the agents were already outside when he said them, already there, already waiting for morning. I did not owe him a warning. I owed him nothing but the truth that was already coming for him, whether I spoke it or not. They knocked on the door, and my mother answered it, and I heard her call for my father in a voice that had gone very careful and very controlled. And I stayed at the kitchen table with my coffee, and I listened to the sound of my father's footsteps on the hardwood floor and the creak of the front door opening wide. I heard one of the agents introduce herself. I heard the word federal. I heard my father's voice, which had been so large and so certain at dinner the night before, go suddenly completely quiet. Now, I want you to stay with me, because what happened over the next several hours is the part of this story that I have thought about almost every day since. Not with satisfaction, I want to be honest with you about that. Not with the kind of triumphant feeling you might expect after everything that had come before. What I felt was something much more complicated, and I think if you stay with me through this, you'll understand why. My father came back into the kitchen about 20 minutes after the agents arrived. He had aged somehow in those 20 minutes. That is the only way I know how to describe it. The squareness in his shoulders, that particular military posture he had maintained his entire adult life, it had gone slightly softer. He stood in the doorway and he looked at me sitting at the kitchen table, and something moved across his face that I had never seen there before. He said, "They want to talk to me about Warren." I said, "I know." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "How long have you known?" I looked at him. I thought about the dinner the night before. I thought about 37 years of dinners, of looking across tables and watching his eyes move past me to land on Daniel or Lydia. I thought about every school event he had arrived at late and left early, every achievement I had mentioned carefully, quietly, and watched him receive with mild, distracted acknowledgement. I thought about the word pathetic. "Long enough," I said. He sat down across from me at the kitchen table. This man who had commanded battalions, who had a portrait in the hallway, who had never once in my memory sat at a kitchen table and looked uncertain about anything. He sat down and he put his hands flat on the table, and he said, "What's going to happen?" And here is where I need you to really listen, because this is the part of the story that matters most. Not the investigation, not the arrest that came 3 days later when Warren Briggs was taken into federal custody, not the headlines or the case documents or any of the things that became part of the public record. This moment, right here, at this kitchen table, is the heart of it. I could have been cold. I could have reminded him of what he had said the night before. I could have let him sit in the uncertainty I had lived with for 4 months, let him feel a fraction of what it had felt like to carry that knowledge alone while he stood at his dinner table and mocked me in front of company. I didn't. Not because I had forgiven him. Forgiveness, real forgiveness, is a longer and more complicated process than a single morning. But because I was not my father. I was not the person who used knowledge as a weapon. I was not the person who performed strength by making other people feel small. I had spent my entire career doing exactly the opposite of that, and I was not going to stop now, not even for him, not even after everything. I told him what I could tell him. I told him that if he had no direct knowledge of or involvement in the fraudulent contracting, and if he cooperated fully and honestly with the investigation, the most likely outcome was that he would be a witness rather than a defendant. I told him to get a lawyer before he said another word to anyone. I told him that the agents outside were professionals doing their jobs, and that the best thing he could do for himself was to treat them accordingly. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I didn't know about the fraud. I knew Warren was cutting corners somewhere, but I didn't know the scope of it. I should have looked harder. I should have asked more questions." Then tell them that, exactly that, and get a lawyer first. He nodded. He looked at his hands on the table. He said, very quietly, without looking up, "I didn't know about your case." "I know you didn't. I meant what I said last night in the wrong way." He paused. I know that's not enough." I picked up my coffee cup. I looked at this man who had loomed so large over my entire life, who had taken up so much space in my head for so many years, and I felt something I had not expected to feel. Not anger, not vindication, something much quieter than either of those things, something that felt almost like pity, not the condescending kind, the human kind, the kind that comes when you finally see another person clearly enough to understand that their smallness was never really about you. "No," I said, "it's not enough, but it's a start." Then I got up, put my cup in the sink, and went to get ready for work. The case against Warren Briggs took 14 months to fully prosecute. He was ultimately convicted on 9 counts of federal fraud and sentenced to 11 years. 2 other former military officers were convicted alongside him. The total amount of fraudulently obtained funds recovered with interest and penalties came to just over $51 million. My father was never charged. He cooperated fully, as I had told him to. He testified in the trial. He sat in that courtroom and told the truth about what he had known and what he had suspected and what he had chosen not to look at too closely. And it was not a comfortable truth, but it was the truth, and the jury and the judge received it as such. He lost the friendship of 31 years. He lost a great deal of his standing in the veterans community he had been part of since his retirement. Some of that was his own doing. Some of it was the simple and brutal way that proximity to scandal works, even when you are not the one who committed it. He called me the night the verdict came in. I almost didn't answer. I stood there looking at my phone with his name on the screen, and I thought about how many calls I had made to him over the years that had gone to voicemail, how many dinners where I had sat across from him and felt invisible, how many times the word pathetic had been communicated without actually being spoken, years before he said it out loud at Lydia's engagement dinner. I answered. He said, "I watched you in that courtroom, Mara. I watched you every day that you were there." I said, "I know, I saw you." He said, "I didn't understand. I didn't understand what you had built, what you actually do. I thought I understood what the JAG Corps was, and I didn't. I thought I understood what you were, and I was wrong." The line was quiet for a moment. Outside my window, the city was doing what cities do at night, all its ordinary sounds layered over each other in that particular way that makes you feel both alone and surrounded at once. He said, "I'm sorry for what I said at dinner. I'm sorry for what I have said, the version of it I said that night and all the other versions before it. I'm sorry it took this for me to see you clearly." I did not tell him it was fine, because it wasn't fine, not entirely, and I have spent enough years around legal proceedings to know that false comfort is its own kind of dishonesty. But I told him that I heard him, and I told him that hearing him mattered, even if it didn't fix everything. And I told him that I thought the person he could be, going forward, was better than the person he had been, and that I would rather spend time with the person he was becoming than hold on to my anger at the person he had been. He cried. My father, retired Colonel Gerald Calloway, decorated veteran, man who had a portrait in the hallway, sat on the other end of the phone, and he cried. And I sat in my apartment, in the quiet, and I listened to him, and I did not say anything, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can give another person is simply the space to feel what they feel without rushing them through it. I want to tell you something about quiet people, about the ones who have spent their lives in rooms where other voices are louder, where other personalities are bigger, where their own contributions tend to land softly and be absorbed into the air without much acknowledgement. I want to tell you something that took me a long time to learn and that I believe completely. Quiet is not the same as weak. Quiet is not the same as having nothing to say. Quiet, in many cases, is the choice to let your work speak at a volume that words simply cannot match. Quiet is the decision to move through the world without announcing your intentions to people who would use that information to undermine you. Quiet is a strategy. Quiet is a form of strength that is frequently mistaken for its opposite, and that mistake is almost always made by people who will eventually be surprised. I have been surprised, genuinely, happily surprised, by how many people reach out to me after they hear this story, by how many women especially tell me that they recognized something in it, that they have sat at tables where their accomplishments were minimized, that they have been in rooms where the loudest voice in the space felt permanently assigned to someone else, that they have felt the particular exhaustion of carrying significant things quietly without acknowledgement and wondering whether anyone would ever actually see them. If that is you, if any part of that is you, I want you to know that I see you. And I want you to know that the agents were already parked outside before I said a word. The work had already spoken. It almost always does. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something, if there is someone in your life who needs to hear it, please share this video with them. Send it to a friend, a sister, a colleague, anyone who has ever been underestimated and kept going anyway. And leave me a comment below. Tell me what part of this story hit you hardest. Tell me if you have ever sat at a table like that one. Tell me about the quiet strength you carry. I read every comment. I mean that, every single one. There is one more thing I want to tell you before this story is finished, about Lydia's wedding, which happened in May, 8 months after the investigation became public. I almost didn't go, not because of anything to do with my father or the case, but simply because the months between that dinner and the wedding had been relentlessly demanding, professionally and personally, that by the time the spring arrived, I was running on empty in a way I hadn't been in years. My therapist, and I say that without any hesitation because every person who does difficult emotional work needs support of their own. My therapist told me to go. She said, "You don't go for the wedding, you go to close a chapter and open a new one." She was right, as she usually is. I stood at the back of the church in the dress my sister had picked for all her bridesmaids, pale blue with a simple cut, and I watched Lydia walk down the aisle on my father's arm. He had aged visibly since the trial. The year had marked him in ways that retirement had not. But he walked straight. He held her arm gently. He handed her to her husband with the kind of care that told me he was paying attention to this moment in a way he might not have before. Paying full attention, not half of it reserved for thinking about himself. At the reception, he found me by the bar. He didn't make a speech. He didn't try to explain anything. He just stood next to me for a moment, looking out at the dance floor where Lydia was dancing with her new husband, and he said, "You look like your grandmother. She was the strongest person I ever knew. I should have told you that a long time ago." I didn't say anything. I just nodded. We stood there together for a little while, watching the dancing, not talking. And that was enough. Not everything, but enough. A beginning. My name is Mara Calloway. I am a lieutenant colonel in the Judge Advocate General's Corps. I have spent my career following evidence wherever it leads, no matter how uncomfortable the destination. I have sat at tables where I was the quietest person in the room and walked out of rooms that would never be the same because I had been in them. The promotion my father called pathetic was, by objective measure, the direct result of a 22-month investigation that recovered $51 million of fraudulently obtained federal funds, put 3 people in federal prison, and restructured the oversight protocols for defense contracting in 2 separate military branches. It was also, by any measure that matters to me, simply the next step in a career that I built day by day, alone and without announcement, the way I build everything. My father said my promotion was pathetic, and 2 federal agents were already parked outside his house. I think about that sometimes, about the particular timing of it, about how in that moment he was so certain about what I was and what I had done and what it meant, and how in that same moment, the answer to every single one of his assumptions was already waiting on the other side of his front door. That is what patience looks like from the inside. That is what it looks like to do the work and trust that the work will eventually speak for itself. That is what it looks like to be the quietest person in the room and know, really know, with the kind of certainty that doesn't need to be announced, that quiet is its own kind of power. Thank you for watching this entire story. If you stayed all the way to this moment, I want you to know that means something real to me. Please share this video with someone who needs it. Leave a comment and tell me your story. And if you haven't already subscribed to The Quiet Colonel, now is the time. Hit that subscribe button and the bell and come back for the next story. Because there are more of them. There are always more of them. And every single one is worth the time. I will see you in the next one. But I want to go back. I want to take you back further, because the story of that dinner and those federal agents, it doesn't start with the case. It doesn't start with the investigation or the shell companies or Warren Briggs. It starts much earlier than that. It starts in a specific moment that I have carried with me for more than 20 years, a moment so small that my father almost certainly does not remember it, and yet it shaped more of who I became than almost anything else in my life. I was 14 years old. It was a Saturday afternoon in Nashville, and I had just come home from a statewide academic competition in Nashville. I had competed in a legal reasoning and mock trial event. Yes, even at 14, I was drawn to exactly the kind of work I would eventually do for a living, and I had won. First place out of 62 participants from across the state. I had a certificate and a small trophy, and this feeling in my chest like a door had opened that I hadn't known was there. My father was in the living room watching college football when I came in. I stood in the doorway with my trophy and my certificate, and I said, "Dad, I won, first place." He looked up from the game, he looked at the trophy, he said, "Good girl," and then he looked back at the television. That was it. Good girl. The same thing you might say to a dog who had done a trick correctly. I went up to my room and I put the trophy on my desk and I sat on my bed for a long time and I thought about that. about how I had driven 4 hours round trip and spent 8 hours competing and come home with first place out of 62 people, and the response was 2 words and a return to the game. And then I made a decision, not dramatically, not with tears, just quietly and with complete clarity. I decided that I was done waiting for his attention to arrive. I was going to do the work because the work mattered, not because he would notice, not because anyone would notice, because it mattered, and because I was good at it, and because that was enough. That decision, made on a Saturday afternoon in October when I was 14 years old, with a small trophy on my desk and a football game audible from downstairs, that decision is the reason I was able to spend 22 months working a case that most people had written off. That decision is the reason I was sitting at that kitchen table with my coffee when the agents knocked on the door. That decision is, in a very direct and traceable way, the reason $51 million was returned to the federal government, and 3 people who had stolen it were put in prison. It is strange when you think about it, the small cruelties, the small dismissals, how they can become, if you let them, the foundation of something enormous. How the 2 words that were meant to minimize you can become the engine that drives you further than anyone expected, including yourself. I did not always handle this gracefully. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think there is a version of this story that gets told too cleanly, where the person who was underestimated marches forward with perfect confidence and never once doubts themselves, and that is not true, and I will not pretend it is true. There were years, particularly in my late 20s, when I worked alongside colleagues who were louder and less thorough and more comfortable taking credit for shared work, and I watched them advance while I was still careful and quiet and producing results that seemed to disappear into the institutional air. There were years when I wondered whether I had chosen the wrong strategy, whether being quiet was actually costing me things that loudness would have won. There was a specific period, about 8 years into my career, when I was passed over for a position I had applied for and was, by any objective metric, more qualified for than the person who received it. The officer who got the job was charming and well-connected, and had made sure that the right people knew his name and his ambitions. I had not done that. I had instead produced excellent work that not enough of the right people were aware of. It stung in a way I did not fully admit at the time. It made me question whether the way I had chosen to move through the world was serving me or costing me. I talked to a mentor about it, a woman who had retired as a colonel herself, who had navigated military legal work in an era when it was considerably harder for women than it was becoming in mine. She listened to everything I said, and then she was quiet for a moment, and then she said something I have never forgotten. She said, "The loudest voice in the room gets heard first, but the most thorough work gets heard last, and last is when it matters most." I thought about that for a long time. I still think about it. I think she was right in a very specific and important way, that the kind of work that changes things, that actually moves the needle on the things that matter, tends to be work that is quiet and deep and patient, and it tends to reveal itself at exactly the moment when it cannot be ignored. Not when someone is trying to impress a room, not when someone is performing competence for an audience. When the chips are down, when the real question is being asked, when what you actually know and can actually prove is the only thing that counts. That is when the quiet people speak, and when they speak, it is usually the last word. The morning after the trial verdict, after Warren Briggs was found guilty on 9 counts and the judge set the sentencing date, my phone started ringing in a way it had never rung before. People I had worked with years ago and barely spoken to since. People from my OCS class who had taken very different paths. Colleagues from within the JAG Corps who had been aware of the investigation but had not understood its scope until the verdict made it public. And yes, some journalists, some requests for comment, some interview requests that I declined, because the work speaks for itself and does not need me to narrate it for cameras. But there was one call that morning that I want to tell you about, because it is the call that made me cry. Not the conversation with my father, not the verdict itself, but this one call from a woman I will call Captain R, because she is still active duty and her name is not mine to share. She had been a young JAG officer early in my career, someone I had mentored briefly before her assignment had taken her to a different post. She called me that morning and she said, "I have been following this case for 2 years without knowing you were the one working it. I just found out this morning. I wanted to call and tell you that I always knew you were going to do something like this. Even when you were just my mentor at a small post in Georgia, I always knew." I don't know exactly why that undid me in a way that nothing else that morning had. Maybe because it was so simple. Maybe because it was just someone seeing me, really seeing me, the way my father hadn't, the way I had learned not to need, and saying so. Maybe because after 22 months of carrying something enormous and largely alone, the acknowledgement felt like putting down a weight I hadn't fully realized I was carrying. I told her thank you. I meant it in a way that I rarely mean that particular phrase. I want to talk about the investigation itself for a moment, because I think it deserves more than the summary I gave you earlier. I think the details matter, not because fraud cases are inherently compelling, some of them are extraordinarily dull, honestly, but because the details of how this particular case was built are the details of how quiet, patient, thorough work actually functions. And I think if you understand how the work was done, you understand something important about what I mean when I say that quiet is a strategy. When I inherited the case, the file was about 2 inches thick, which sounds like a lot until you understand that for a fraud case of this scope, 2 inches is almost nothing. There were some flagged invoices, some anomalies in procurement records, and a preliminary list of shell companies that seemed to be receiving payments from defense contract accounts without clear corresponding deliverables. That was the starting point: flagged invoices and a list of LLC names. The previous investigator, my colleague who had retired, had tried to trace the LLC ownership and hit walls at every turn. These were not simple structures. They were layered, with LLCs owning other LLCs, registered in multiple states and in 2 offshore jurisdictions, with nominee directors and anonymous beneficial owners. It is, frankly, a structure that is designed specifically to be untraceable. Most people who look at something like that see it for what it is and decide that the likelihood of successful prosecution is too low to justify the resources. Most people are not wrong to think that. The odds genuinely are bad. What tips the odds is patience and a particular kind of lateral thinking, the willingness to stop asking who owns this company and start asking instead what this company does. What services did it invoice for? Were those services actually performed? If they weren't performed, who signed off saying they were? And who had the authority and the motive to sign off on something that wasn't real? That last question is where the whole maze started to crack open, because the signature authority, the people who approved payment on the fraudulent invoices, that was a much smaller group than the shell company ownership structure suggested. And when I started cross-referencing those approval signatures with personnel records, assignment histories, and this is the piece that took the longest and that I am most proud of, a reconstruction of informal social networks based on things like shared post assignments, co-authored reports, and attendance at the same professional conferences over a period of 15 years, the picture that emerged was not a wall of anonymous LLCs. It was a group of 7 people, several of whom had known each other for decades, who had built a system of mutual protection and mutual profit inside a structure designed to look like standard bureaucratic process. Warren Briggs was not the ringleader. He was the most senior, the most visible, and the one whose conviction sent the clearest message. But the architecture of the fraud was built by a much more methodical mind, a mind that I spent 14 months trying to fully understand before I was certain enough to include in the evidence package I handed to the federal task force. I will not tell you that mind's name, because the case is still partially sealed, and because even the parts that are public are not mine to summarize out of order. What I will tell you is that understanding that mind, understanding how it worked, how it thought, how it built systems designed to survive scrutiny, was the most intellectually demanding thing I have ever done in my professional life. And I will tell you that there were days that I sat at my desk with my coffee going cold beside me, and my wall of connections, and my stacks of documents, and I felt something that I can only describe as a particular kind of joy. The joy of a puzzle that is genuinely hard, pursued without any guarantee of resolution, purely because it is there, and because you are capable of attempting it. That joy, that specific, quiet, absorbed joy of difficult work pursued for its own sake, that is the thing my father never understood about me. He saw what I did and measured it against what he had done, and he found it wanting because the metrics he was using were the wrong metrics. He measured in rank achieved by a certain age, in commands held, in visible authority exercised. He could not see what I was doing because what I was doing did not look like anything he recognized as achievement. It looked like sitting quietly at a desk. It looked like reading files. It looked, from the outside, like nothing much at all. This is the thing I want you to hear, if you hear nothing else in this entire story. The thing that looks like nothing much from the outside is frequently the thing that changes everything. The person sitting quietly in the corner of the room is frequently the person who understood the room better than anyone in it before they ever walked through the door. The work that doesn't announce itself is frequently the work that lasts. My father learned this. He learned it the hard way. The way we tend to learn the things we should have known earlier. He learned it because the agents came to his door, and the trial happened, and the verdict came in, and through it all he watched his daughter do her job with exactly the same quiet competence she had always had, and this time he could not look away. This time, the stakes were too high for distraction. There is something I want to add here. Something that did not make it into the conversations I have had publicly about this case, because it feels personal in a way that the professional details do not. In the weeks after the verdict, while the sentencing phase was still being prepared and my father was cooperating with the investigation, and everything was still very raw and very present, I went back to Clarksville. Not for a visit, I had an obligation there, a speaking engagement at a veterans organization that had been scheduled long before any of this happened. I stood up in front of a room full of veterans and their families, and I talked about the importance of financial integrity in defense procurement, which is, I realize, not the most scintillating topic in the world, but which matters enormously to the people whose budgets are affected by fraud, and whose equipment reliability can be compromised when the money meant to maintain it has been redirected to shell companies. Afterward, a man came up to me. He was probably 70 years old, a Vietnam veteran with the kind of face that has been through weather. He shook my hand with both of his, and he said, "My son serves. I think about every dollar that was supposed to keep him safe. I think about it every day." He didn't say anything else. He just nodded at me and walked away. I stood there, in that community center in Clarksville, Tennessee, in the town where I grew up feeling invisible, and I thought about that man's son. About the $51 million, about what $51 million actually means when it is converted from numbers in a document to equipment, to maintenance, to the 10,000 small logistical things that keep a soldier safe in a place where safe is not the default condition. That is why the work mattered. Not the verdict, not the headlines, not the moment my father finally looked at me and understood something he should have understood a long time ago. The man's son, the abstract soldier at the end of the supply chain who will never know that anything happened, who will simply find that the equipment works the way it is supposed to work, who will come home to someone who loves them because the systems that were supposed to protect them were actually doing their job. That is what quiet work looks like when it is finished. Invisible, unremarked upon, exactly as it should be. I want to tell you one final thing about my father before I close this story properly, about something that happened about 6 months after Lydia's wedding, on a completely ordinary Tuesday afternoon when I happened to be in Clarksville for a meeting and stopped by my parents' house without really planning to. My mother was out. My father was in his study, the room with the portrait and the service ribbons in their frames under glass, sitting at his desk with reading glasses on, going through a box of old photographs. He looked up when I came in and waved me to a chair, and I sat down and we were quiet together for a moment, in the way that we had learned to be quiet together, which was still new but felt increasingly like a language we were both learning. He held up a photograph, black and white, slightly faded, a group of young officers standing in front of what looked like a military installation somewhere very flat and very hot. "Do you know who that is?" he asked, pointing to a figure in the back row. I looked. I didn't recognize the installation, I didn't recognize most of the faces, but the figure he was pointing to, young, slight, standing very straight with her arms at her sides and her eyes looking directly at the camera with an expression that was impossible to read, I recognized her. "That's my grandmother," I said. "That's your grandmother," he said. "Captain Eleanor Calloway, JAG Corps, 1968. I looked at the photograph for a long time. "You never told me she was JAG Corps," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "I never told you a lot of things I should have told you. I was too busy making sure you knew what I had done to bother telling you what the women in this family had done before either of us was born." He handed me the photograph. "Keep it," he said. "I still have it on my desk. My grandmother, Captain Eleanor Calloway, JAG Corps, 1968, standing straight, eyes forward, expression unreadable, quiet in the way I am quiet, strong in the way I am strong. I come from a long line of people who did not need to announce themselves. I just didn't know it until my father finally told me. If you have stayed with this story all the way to this moment, you are exactly the kind of person I made it for. Thank you. Please share this video with someone who needs it. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I genuinely read them, and your stories matter to me more than I can say in a video outro. Subscribe to The Quiet Kernel if you haven't yet, hit the bell so you never miss a story, and come back soon. There is always another story. There is always another person who was quiet when the world expected noise, and patient when the world expected reaction, and let the work speak when words would have been insufficient. There is always another kernel who waited for the right moment. See you in the next one.